So just starting off nicely, what are the aims of Black Poppy Rose?
So the aims of Black Poppy Rose are to empower and educate the entire world around historical narratives that combine all people, all cultures, all heritage, all genders, all sex, all things that make us humans on this planet, and to be able to understand circumstantial facts and historical events that have impacted our lives, our presents, our past, and our futures.
So anymore, is there anyone's story that you want to share of a Black Army member who doesn't or hasn't got enough publicity?
Who hasn't got enough publicity? Is a good question. So we have, who do we have? Oh, we have Lewis Tully. Lewis Tully served in the Royal Air Force. He is from Islington in London, and he signed up to the war, but he was unwanted because he was of mixed heritage. And what people didn't know is that his father had served in World War One from Islington as well. Although his father was darker in complexion, Lewis looked lighter in complexion, and we have, you know, color caste systems that we've had for centuries in regards to the acceptance of people based on their race. But Lewis Tully, when he came back from the war, he had understood himself in a very different way and was able to benefit his community by changing many of the political narratives around race, around inclusion, around acceptance. After the war, so when we get to the Windrush era of the Empire Windrush coming, there was already a collective conversation going on within certain areas of London around how the war had impacted communities, especially those who were living in Britain at the time who were classified as Black or from Black origins.
It's, you know, of course we learn about these certain soldiers and things, and I spoke about this with you when we were talking on the phone. It's mad about how it's incredible these people have done so much more than even just, you know, fight in a war, yet we're not taught one bit, whether that's in school, whether that's outside, that we're not taught about these things at all. So what you're doing is absolutely incredible.
Thank you.
So how far do you think that generational trauma in Black communities has an impact on young people's transition from childhood to adulthood?
15 generations. And I, as a genealogist, I classify 15 generations over 300 years. So every 100 years, we should have between 4 to 5 generations based on people having their children in their, you know, early 20s to 25. So if they're having them later, then it would result in us having 4 generations, but history doesn't show us that. So it's generally about 5 generations per 100 years. And when you get to the end of those 100 years, you then lose the generation from 100 years before, because that's just through age and through lifestyle and changes and developments and things. But what you do is you pass on names, you pass on pain, you pass on trauma, blueprints, frameworks, ideologies, concepts, foods, recipes, practices, religions, and various different concepts of historical understanding and belonging. And you pass those on generation to generation, of which this is how we identify ourselves, and we start to classify who we are in the worlds that we live in. And when you're coming from the Black community who have continuously been classified as different things, terming from Negro to Black to African Caribbean and all other terms that have been gifted, you lose that sense of identity along the way, because you're trying to fit in to an ideology of a world that tells you where you should belong, how you should belong, and continues to marginalize you as you continue to try and fit in to the narrative that has been gifted. It also develops the European mindset around how they conceptualize other groups of people as well as themselves. And with history putting Europeans at the top, it also allows for that continuation to go on, because there's been no reclassifications of what white looks like, but there has been for Black and Asian and Native American and Indigenous communities. And as a result of that, it passes down historical legacies of those who feel that they matter more than others.
Great. So to what extent do you think that the role of Black soldiers is portrayed in the media, and is enough being done?
Well, over the last 10 years, more has been done that has been done for the last 90 years. And I'm not sure whether or not that's because there was an additional visibility of that, because Black Poppy Rose is 11. And just before we embarked upon the centenary of 2014, I had started a conversation around what is Blackness, you know, why were we in these wars? how it's impacted our communities, and look at the stories that have been left out, and for young people who were growing up in this country told that they were being untruthful when they said that their ancestors had served, when they had, you know, items, memorabilia, discharge papers at home to prove that. When it comes down to visibility of the Commonwealth, due to the independence of many of the nations, it has been deemed that it's not necessary for others to, you know, put in that level of effort. And when you're coming from the United Kingdom, whose narratives do you put forward? You put the people from this land forward. And the people from this land, they look white, and they're the mass majority here. But when it comes down to talking about Britain as an empire, I don't think it's easy to just talk about the empire just to say an empire existed, because history shows that the army were the biggest purchasers of slaves during a time period where they were enlisting men into service into their armies. And in 1807, when we had the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, we have Britain enlisting the captured Africans that they had captured from France and Spain and Portugal, again enlisting them into lifelong services into their armies, and women and children into the plantations in the West Indies. So when it comes down to talking about the visibility of those who served, it empowers a community to understand that they matter. It empowers a community to understand that they have a place here. And when we look at the history of this country and the world, it always shows a certain level of displacement for groups of people. So we have, you know, keep Britain white, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. You're unable to talk about the pride and the shame at the same time when you're talking about a history where racism has actually capitalized on ensuring that men and women who served have been disproportionately paid, treated, but then combine that history and narrative at the same time.
So just like, this is a question off the grid, do you think we need to learn more about, like, for example, education? It's already, I know Blam's been doing some things to get more Black British education in, but do you think we need to learn more about the Commonwealth and the empire itself? Because I know that it existed, but I wouldn't say I know that much. I know which certain countries, but I'd never view it that way. Do you think that talk of the empire and the Commonwealth needs to be spoke about when we do learn about the wars in history?
I think we have to have a reclassification on the word education to start off with. And when it comes down to inclusion, it's about being truthful about how the impacts of being an empire have actually developed this country. Because when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, nobody talks about the development of the Industrial Revolution. And as a result of the slave trade, it allowed for the Industrial Revolution in this country to be extremely successful. So for Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, London to be able to thrive as a result of the capital that was being raised from the transatlantic slave trade and the rising cotton, sugarcane and textiles, for this country to be able to create manufacturing plants, to create jobs and to create wealth and to create legacy. All of this is on the back of that empire history. And when we start talking about it, it's about talking about how the rippling effects of how it has benefited one community and how it has impacted another community.
So how do you think that schools and young people can help to share the message and aims of BlackPoppyRose?
By learning about their own personal histories. So I encourage everybody to learn about their histories, to ask their mums, their dads, whether or not you have foster parents, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, because the concepts of family change all the time. And where you're safe and where you're comfortable is where you are able to grow. So understanding how to build your foundation at home allows us to be able to continue to share these stories and narratives. So at no point are we ever saying, oh, that group wasn't included, oh, that person's narrative not included, because we've made it a base foundation that everybody's narratives is wanted and included. And as a result, we're able to make correlations between experiences so we can start having a better understanding of people, a better understanding of what we conceptualize to be mental health, what we conceptualize to be trauma, and the fact that all of our opinions will be very different, and that is something that is okay. And that's the world we live in, because diversity is the spice of life. Who would want to have the same meal over and over again every day if they were able to try something new and see how they could incorporate that into their culture, into their well-being, into their developments, for them to be able to enhance the people that they're still learning to become?
So do you think, can you just give me some examples of ways, rather than just, looking back at diaries, notes, things like that? Because I remember you were telling me about, was in the RAF is celebrating, was it the Caribbeans?
Pilots of the Caribbean.
Mm.
Yeah.
So do you have any more links or, websites, things like that, which would be quite useful to look at?
Oh, of course. There are videos on YouTube. So I've just done a educational program with the National Army Museum. It's called, what is it called? It's called BlackPoppyRose, something or other. But there are a lot of resources that we're creating on YouTube. So type in BlackPoppyRose, you'll be able to find it. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So if you go to their website, there will be there's materials that they're also producing online. The Museum of London also have an exhibition around Black Britain, which includes those who served and the impacts of servicemen and women to this country. We have the Imperial War Museum. They are getting ready to launch their World War II exhibition coming up soon, which will be inclusive of the entire Commonwealth. We have, what else do we have? The Windrush Foundation. So they talk about the servicemen and women that came aboard the Windrush and within that era and what they significantly went on to do. So we have like Sam King. He was the first Black mayor of Southwark and assisted in the political narratives around the disproportional policies that were in place for the West African communities at the time. He was also a supporter of the Notting Hill Carnival. So it was a lot of financial backing that allowed that to happen, to be able to have visibility of West Indian culture on the streets. So as a result, that's, one of the biggest economical events that take place in this country, which brings in millions as a result of showcasing that culture. And a lot of local libraries have started to also do this work. So they're encouraging communities to come in and share their stories so that they can build their archives with a lot of history from the present. So we start becoming more active in how we narrate and how we preserve conversation that we're going to have again in 50 years and being able to keep up to date with information on what's going on in the communities today.
Of course, I've been saying it about 10 times now, that you're an incredible speaker. What would you say to young people, especially the Black youth, about growing up and the difficulties and struggles that come with life? What advice would you give people?
What advice would I give people? I would give parents the advice to start being truthful to their children so that you prepare them for some of the situations that they may come in contact with, so that they are prepared with confidence to be able to confront any kind of, adversity that comes their way, whether or not they need to run or whether or not they need to stand and, fight. But when it comes down to living, we're all living every day, we all have new experiences and there are a lot of things that we aren't comfortable talking about. So with young people, I would definitely encourage, your thoughts and your feelings, share them with people that you trust, share them with, your peers, to be able to see what kind of conversations you can start having so you can work out how to take those thoughts and feelings forward, because it's those thoughts and feelings that allow you to develop the person that you understand yourself to be, not the one that society enforces on top of you, or allows you to be able to explore and express things that you could have never felt before, because we're new to this human experience. And when somebody's classifying you, it doesn't give you the opportunity to actually think, well, what did I think in the first place? Where was my original thought? Because somebody else has already given me one that I now have to process and work out whether or not I take option A or B. Whereas if I actually had the chance to, I may have been able to get to option F. And that was, where I was most settled. So it's to take time with when you look at the world and you see that so many things are wrong. We were born into a world which sustains itself based on the history that we are now beginning to learn. And as a result of that, we find ways how to fix some of these problems, but we did not make them. And it's try not to burden yourselves with the fact that, there's so much that needs to be fixed, so much that needs to be done. You are one person, we are all one person, and we are here to do one thing. And to look at how you understand these terms education, and how you're able to apply that education to developing something that you will then want to enjoy doing in your future.
If a young person wants Black Poppy Rose pins or other Black Poppy wreath or anything like that sent to their schools or community, how should they get around doing that?
info@blackpoppyrose.org.
Mm-hmm. I thought it would be a nice short snappy one to end on.
Because when it comes down to, you know, the Black Poppy Rose is a symbol. The idea is that to have something, but what we are going to be encouraging is how we can actually start creating new things, new representations around it. So you have to have something to be able to create and evolve into something else. So it's to encourage us to be able to see that there is something more that we can have, because for centuries we've had one. And before Black Poppy Rose, we had one. And now we have Black Poppy Rose. There should be no reason why we don't have other ones that represent other concepts around what we think about, what we think around identity, what we think around whatever it is that we think about, what we want to celebrate.
So do you think that when, you know, how we have the remembrance memorial statues and there's always the wreath, do you think besides that, beside the red poppy wreath, there should be a black poppy wreath?
Do I think? Well, when it comes to what I do, I don't only cover Britain, I cover the French, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Dutch occupation of the continent and the West Indies and the Americas. So the narrative isn't limited to the British experience. And when we deal with the red poppy, it's to do with the British experience coming from the Commonwealth. So the remembrance is around that in its entirety. When we're ready to evolve in this country, to include the narratives of others outside of that, then there will be a place for it there. So,
for example, I mean, I know that I'm going to be talking to my head teacher about this tomorrow to try see what we can do to get some of this in. So it's info@blackpoppyrose.org.
It's send people to the website, let them see what's available. It's info@blackpoppyrose, it's contact us, it's book a discovery call, have a conversation, because for change to happen, you have to understand why you want the change in the first place. And a lot of people aren't ready for the change, and that's fine. There are a lot of people who are ready, and we will be here for whenever they are ready. And that's the process of growth and development, because anything in history is about when people are ready and what it actually means for them to do something that is not quite inside the box that we're used to.
That's great. That's all of the questions done. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.